Robert Murray, of course, is a well-renowned sculptor, painter, printmaker, art teacher. He lives now in Pennsylvania and but also spends summers in Point Barrel in Ontario. And Robert is Vancouver-born, Saskatoon raised, and he's really been widely credited with redefining public art in North America. You know, his work is in the Metropolitan, the Whitney, the Hirshhorn, the National Gallery, Museum of Modern Art in Montreal, and many, many municipal and university and corporate installations throughout this continent. You know, back in the 60s, there was a work called Rainmaker installed in the, I believe in the city of Saskatoon, and it was met with disgruntlement because I think a lot of the good people of Saskatoon were expecting representational work of maybe a grain farmer or something, and what they got was sort of undulating steel in a sort of a green color with arcs and curves, and it took some getting used to, and I gather it took them a few decades, but now everybody, of course, has embraced it. And, you know, to that, I'm going to quote here, Robert has said, he said, I always feel if the work isn't somewhat provocative, then you failed. It's not that it's meant to be controversial necessarily, but it's meant to be provocative. And I think let's turn the mic over to Robert on that note. So you can tell us about the provocative works that you created for us. Welcome.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Well, as you gathered from Elizabeth's comments, I've been run out of a lot of towns. And perhaps Victoria will be one of them. Well, it was an interesting experience moving from painting to sculpture with a piece I built for Saskatoon. Because among other things, I didn't have a facility to build the work myself, so I went to John East Ironworks in Saskatoon and asked them if I could come into their place and they'd give me some help to get the piece constructed, and that set up a pattern I've been following ever since. So while these pieces here are mostly built in my shop in Pennsylvania that I built, when they get to a larger size, I generally rely on the help of fabricators to get the work built. And I've worked in a lot of different places, but most of my work, like a lot of New York sculptors, was built by a guy called Don Lippincott, who had a specialty fabricating plant up in North Haven, Connecticut. And a lot of us took the train up there, or in my case, I flew up. And Don was somewhat unique in those days in that that's all he did is work with sculptures. He didn't weld up submarines or anything else in the background, like most of the other places I've worked. But it became a good way to get good-sized sculpture built. And Don also had a large field next to the plant where those of us who lived in New York and lived in small apartments, we couldn't possibly stand up some of the things that we built. And so Don provided a place, and it was the go-to place for many years. A lot of architects, people interested in the arts came up there, and the next thing we know, people were talking about something called public art, which by default, I guess we were involved in. And because the work was there and available, a lot of exhibitions were built around it. I guess as far as these works are concerned is that they, while some of these have been built larger, others are still in the proposal stage. And I generally start out this way with pieces this size. And they serve a number of functions. One of them is they help me decide whether or not the piece might possibly exist or not, or it's not just a figment of my imagination. They also help as a talking point with a fabricator. And since most fabricators work on a time and materials basis, it also allows us to calculate how big a bank we have to rob in order to get this piece built. The thing about Lippincott that was unique is that most of the pieces were not commissions. We didn't have to stand around waiting for somebody to come up with the money and a place for the work. They were built on a speculative basis, and it was through a special funding arrangement that Don organized. And so it was a way that we could get ideas built that weren't dependent on the limitations of working with architects and so on, which wasn't too good in those days, in the late 50s, early 60s. It later became, I think everybody got more knowledgeable about the process, and I work with architects all the time now, and I don't usually run into the nonsense we had initially about the constraints on what you might do and what the piece might look like. So these pieces are here because they're small, and they're the seminal idea that in many cases, well, this piece here, for example, is about 12 feet high, and it belongs to the University of Toronto. It's in Toronto, and it's in the process of being refurbished and moved. That's another thing we've been doing a lot of recently. I've been babysitting work all over North America that has now reached a point where it needs to be repainted, or it might need some rewelding or new hardware, and maybe it needs a new concrete foundation, or it's reassuring that this process does actually happen. And the most recent one, I guess, was a piece up in Juneau, Alaska, that's been resited in front of a brand new, enormous state museum, and the piece looks terrific and much, much better than when we originally installed it. So it's actually benefited over the years, which is good. The other pieces that are on the wall maybe deserve some mention. They're a bit of a change of pace. They're based on aerial photographs I take from my airplane, and mostly it's around where I live in Chester, and some of these were in Lancaster County. It's west and north of Philadelphia. And what I do is convert the photographs to large charcoal drawings that are basically the same size as these reliefs. And then I tease out a kind of a linear pattern from the photos. And then I cut veneer patterns, and I use those to guide a plasma cutter, which is just simply an arc that you can cut metal with. And it's very hard to hold steady, freehand, but with the veneer patterns, I can then follow the shapes. Then they're lightly formed in a brake press, and then the whole business is turned over and spot welded back together again. So they have I wouldn't want to drive by them, but the contours are somewhat suggested by the lay of the land. So in a way, they're actually landscape painted. It's just a different way of looking at the landscape, and it's a way I'm used to looking at the landscape. So it was a way to justify the use of the airplane and make some work out of it. So this piece here called Catherine's Field is actually right on the corner of where we live in Pennsylvania. That's an existing field. The one on the back wall is not too far from our area, and its main characteristic is actually something called a white clay creek that flows through that area. But as I say, I don't really think of these as being all that literal after a certain point. They end up being kind of abstract drawings as far as I'm concerned. I'm more interested in the quality of the line and the subtle sort of contouring. And obviously I've left out any buildings that might be there, or any roads, so they kind of go beyond a certain literalness, but they're based on real situations, much like a landscape painter would do. I think most Canadian artists start out as landscape painters, or end up as landscape painters. And I would say it seems to be a characteristic of being a Canadian. We all seem to have it in our blood somewhere. So it's been fun to go from more abstract sculpture back to what I consider to be sort of literal drawings. They just happen to be a view of the earth from straight down. Well, that's probably enough out of me. Does anybody have any questions?
May we ask what you're working on at the moment?
Pardon?
What are you working on at the moment?
Well, I've been babysitting a couple of pieces that are being re-sited and refurbished. And I just got back from Nova Scotia, where a good-sized piece of mine is going to go right on the ocean front, around the corner from Halifax. And the process is that I've worked with the architect and their builder, and we've decided where the sculpture exists. It's in Pennsylvania now. And we've decided where the piece could be shown to best advantage next to this contemporary house. And then I don't think they're going to get the renovation work done before the bad weather sets in. So I think it'll be next spring that we finally install the work. So they end up taking up far too much time, but that's immediately what I'm working on with them.
Any other questions while we have David?
You mentioned the scale, and you said that was about 12 feet. Is all these about in 10 or 12 times?
Most of them are. Well, this piece exists here, and it's a little over 10 feet high, and it's more than 10 feet across. And it's very dramatically sited up near where we go in the summer, near Point of Barrel. It's actually near the Point of Barrel Lighthouse. And it's some people from Toronto have a property there, and who commissioned from this model a larger version of it. And it was built in this place called the Ironworker in Point of Barrel one summer.
Would it still outside have that nice shine to it?
Well, that model is actually made from stainless steel.
Okay.
The actual piece is made from aluminum, stainless steel, and the linear elements of it are resawn cedar, very heavy cedar. Yeah.
Wow.
We have a picture, I think, of it in the window here.
Oh,
yes,
really?
yes, in the front window, so you can see it.
I'll have to look around.
Another question from the back.
Way back here. Is there a particular type of material?
Yeah, I'm sorry, you have to speak up.
Is there a particular type of material that you like to work with as far as metal is concerned?
Well, that's an interesting point, because some of these, this is steel, and that one I just mentioned stainless. These two are, that's steel, this is aluminum. And the small models, I might just grab up whatever I happen to have handy. And they probably have gone through 3 or 4 iterations, and there may be several of them before it's cheaper to work this way than it is to push around 10 tons of steel. That gets expensive. So it's kind of nice to know when you go to work with a fabricator what kind of a problem you're giving them and so on. But most of the pieces are painted with polyurethane paint, epoxy, zinc, chromate, primer, and so on. And that's about as durable a paint as we've been able to come across. The paint's immaterial to me in some respects. It's the color that interests me. And which I suppose I should mention about the reliefs. The reliefs are not actually painted, they're dyed. And they're permanent solvent dyes that are made by a company that makes patinas in Los Angeles. And what we do is we glass bead the surfaces of the aluminum or steel and open up the pores, and then I spray the dye in, and then it's set in quite a permanent ultraviolet protected coating of clear solvent.
Thank you.
Another question here, Robert.
How much of an influence did the fact that Pittsburgh steel industry, Youngstown steel industry, are not far from where you live?
Say that again?
You live in Pennsylvania?
Yes.
I grew up in Ohio and used to spend my
Oh, yeah.
summers in the steel industry area of Youngstown.
Right.
You know? And I'm just wondering how much of an influence does that industry of steel in that area of the country have an influence on your work?
Quite a bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess the first place I worked with of any real size was Bethlehem Steel Shipyard in California. Right. And I haven't worked in Youngstown, but I think we've had steel that's come from one of the plants there. Yeah.
My dad, my granddad.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Well, it's an interesting question in as much as how Don Lippincott got started with his plant is that his dad, Gordon Lippincott, was the Lippincott of Lippincott and Margulies in New York, who was one of the first big industrial design firms. And one of their clients was U.S. Steel. And they were trying to figure out some way to promote Corten steel. So Don got Corten they gave us some of the first steel, but we got it at a very favorable rate. So almost all of the work that people did with Lippincott, especially initially, was work that was built from Corten. And in many cases, people did not paint it. It was just left as weathering steel. And actually, Bethlehem Steel had another version of it called Mamiya steel, but it was U.S. Steel's Corten that got all the play. And then that became a vogue for whatever reason. Every sculptor worth their salt was building sculpture out of Corten. It had to be Corten. But it's got some limitations, which I never liked. It only takes one pigeon to mess up the whole process. But I was always interested in using color, and you're very limited what color you can get from Corten. So we always sandblast the steel and end up painting it usually, in my own case. And then a few other of the sculptors that worked at Lippincott. Ellsworth Kelly in particular, he was partial to the use of color. One of the most fastidious guys that I ever met was Cuz Oldenburg. I always think of Cuz as being a very frivolous artist, but that's not the case. He's a deadly serious guy. And he would pay to have work totally refinished on occasion if he wasn't satisfied with the outcome. But he got Lippincott working in a number of other finishes and materials but most of the people like Louise Nevelson and so on who worked with Don originally, they all worked with Corten steel.
So in the production of these works, would there be quite a close relationship between people who were in the steel industry building other things like ships or planes or, out of metal in relationship to art?
Well, someplace I used to have to lie about what I was doing, but it would depend. I was telling Bob Dilson last night that Bob was from Saskatoon and he knew the East, the people where I built my first sculpture, and they gave me a fellow to work with me to build a piece. And at a certain point, he saw me looking for a place to put a signature stamp. So he said, well, I want to sign it too. And so we had a big discussion about this, and we finally talked him out of it, but it was hard to do. He said, I've done as much work on this piece as you have. I want my name on it. So finally, I think Melise pointed out that it was a little like an architectural firm. No matter how many people work on a building, usually the lead architect gets the credit for it. So that was my excuse. It hasn't always worked. But the thing that led me to go to fabricating plants was in order to form the metal, cut and form the metal, they had all the tools that we required. Brake presses for bending and rolling mills and oxyacetylene plasma cutting devices and so on. And then of course the welding equipment. So it was a logical place to go. For one thing, you couldn't have that in a New York apartment. And the other thing is you couldn't afford a brake press. So it was better to go and work in a shop where they had those tools. And that had a big influence on some of the things we did. Conversely, I can take a little bit of credit for the fact that Lippincott and his men developed some rather unique ways of forming metal that wasn't normal to what you would do with a brake press. But by extending the dies and so on, supporting them exterior to the frame of the press, we were able to do some pretty pretty involved for me.
It's an interesting dialogue between the industry and ours.
And one friend of mine referred to as a wrecked car, but I pointed out that we spent a lot of time getting that car to look that way.
Do we have another last question for Robert Murray? Can you comment on the idea that people say your work is like Alexander Calder's mobiles, but refer to it, I believe, as stabiles? Is this something that you can comment on?
Well, I admired Calder's work and got to meet him. In fact, I like to tell a story. I went up to Lincoln Center in the early 60s to watch a piece called The Guichet being installed near Lincoln Center, and sort of next to the Opera House. And there was a little woman who worked for one of the news stations who Rosanna Dana was based on at Saturday Night Live. I mean, she was a real person. She was a newscaster. And Sandy Calder was a big strapping guy, a big shocker white hair, and whatever her name was, it wasn't Rosanna Dana. She went up to Mr. Calder and said, "I see that Mr. Bunshaft and somebody else are having a big argument about the placement or the disposition of your sculpture. As the sculptor, don't you think you should have something to say for it?" And so I moved closer. I thought, now this is going to be an interesting answer. And Calder said, "They pay for the damn thing. They can put it anywhere they want." I immediately liked Calder. But I thought, gee, I hope I'm that brave someday to say that. But the other thing was, she said, "Well, look, I know it's not cool to ask an artist what something means, but I'd be remiss to my audience if I didn't use the opportunity. So can you enlighten us? What does this sculpture mean?" Calder leaned down over to her and said, "Lady, it doesn't mean a damn thing." And it may be evening too. Now, Calder was, his stables in particular had a strong influence on a number of us. I don't know so much about the color that interested me, but he was somebody who painted his work, so we had that as an example too. But I remember going to Chicago to see Flamingo. It's called, this huge piece. It's in the Civic Plaza, and it was one of the first pieces of I like to say publicly located art rather than public art. And it's terribly impressive. It still is to this day.
Well, we thank you very much. It's a great honor to have you in our midst, and please take the opportunity individually to speak to Robert Murray. He is here for the duration of the afternoon. And we'll give you a round of applause.